Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. This is, of course, our weekly Chats on the Past program, where the museum discusses history with scholars, authors, historians, and artisans. My name is Nicole Carpenter. I'm the Director of Programs and Education at the Westport Museum for History and Culture. At the museum, we are always pleased to offer you our programs for free, but we do always ask for your continued support. Whether you follow our suggested donation of $5 or you simply follow us on all of our social media, we thank you for your support. If you would like to follow us and be notified of future events, you can like us and follow us on Facebook and Twitter at Westport History and on Instagram at Westport History Museum. During our program this evening, if you have any questions at all, please do ask or enter them into the comments box. At the end of our program, I will go through as many of those questions, comments, and anecdotes as we have time for. So please enter those at any time. This evening, we are joined by Mary Thompson, who is currently responsible for research to support programs at Mount Vernon. She has a focus on everyday life on the estate, including household routines, domestic animals, foodways, religious practices, slavery, the Revolutionary War at Mount Vernon, and the enslaved community. Mary Thompson is also a celebrated author, curator, and speaker. Tonight, she is joining us to discuss her book that just came out last year, and it is titled The Only Unavoidable Subject of Regret, George Washington, Slavery, and the Enslaved Community at Mount Vernon. So thank you for joining us tonight, Mary.
Oh, thanks for asking me.
Of course. Now, our first question this evening is one, would you briefly describe what the book is about for our audience? And then would you also enlighten them on how you came to decide the only unavoidable subject?
Well, when I first got to Mount Vernon in 1980, I had just finished graduate school at the University of Virginia and with a master's degree in history. And I got to Mount Vernon, and one of the things we did at UVA was, in the program I was in, was a lot of reading about slavery and the development of slavery in what became the United States. And one of the best classes was was comparing slavery in many different cultures over thousands of years. And that was probably the best class I've ever had anywhere in my life. But I got to Mount Vernon, and after spending, 2 years focused a lot of time on slavery. And I got to Mount Vernon and nobody was talking about slaves. They talked about servants if they discussed the subject at all. And so I was kind of shocked, that 40 years of research that I'd been learning about hadn't made it from the university to public history, to museums and historic sites and places like that. And so my boss knew I was bothered by this. I was periodically, send a memo saying, here's a way we could look at, and at slavery, or give the idea that there are some people there besides just George Washington. And so my boss knew I was interested in the topic. And when we got to the late 1980s, she went to a conference in Charlottesville on interpreting slavery at historic sites. And she got back and she was really, really excited. And she said, drop what you're researching now, which was foodways, and start focusing on slavery, and we'll see what we can come up with. And so that was about 1989. And then it was about 4 years later, we were getting ready to reconstruct George Washington's 16-sided barn using summer interns who literally, they made bricks. everything was done by hand the way it would have been done in the 18th century. And so these interns were coming in and they were going to be doing jobs that would have been done by slaves in the 18th century. Most of these were college-age students. Most of them were white, middle class. And so they asked me to write up several essays on slave life, various aspects of slave life, so that they would know that information when they started working out in the field and being accosted by visitors. So that's how that started. But it wasn't until about 1996, as I kept expanding the first 4 essays, that I realized that it wanted to become a book. And then it just took me from then till last year to finish it. But so anyway, that's how that happened. The book is about, you can't talk about the slaves at Mount Vernon without talking about George and Martha Washington and the other people who were working there. So there were a little over 300 slaves at Mount Vernon in 1799 when George Washington died. And one of the things people forget is that there were also hired and indentured servants there as well. And we've identified, I believe it's close to 300 of those people. They were here, they were not there for necessarily for long periods of time. There were a couple who were, but most of them were there for 4 to 7 years or something while they're working off their indenture. But there were a whole lot of people at Mount Vernon. And so trying to look at how they interacted with one another and the way the Washingtons thought about slavery and just what daily life was like for an enslaved person on the estate. So the book looks at what food, my favorite subject, as well as what the other sorts of rations like clothing that were given out to people or blankets, and what it was like to be a child growing up, an enslaved child growing up at Mount Vernon. And so there's just anything you could think of that somebody might want to know. And I'm sure the people in the audience will come up with some things that I didn't think of, but I was trying really hard to get, to do a full picture of life on the estate for both the enslaved and the not enslaved people, as well as how things changed over the years. George Washington especially had major changes in his feelings about slavery. And so that's sort of what we look at in the book.
Mm-hmm. And as you mentioned in part of your description of the book, you actually begin the book with George and Martha in the description of them as slave owners. Would you go into their thoughts and feelings a little bit more on the institution of slavery, at least at the beginning of their lives?
Well, they had very different experiences with slavery. George Washington was 11 years old when he inherited 10 slaves from from his father's will. And so over the course of his life before the Revolutionary War, he is adding to the slaves at Mount Vernon. He's buying people, he's inheriting people, he's renting people, so that, by the end of his life, we're up to over 300 enslaved people at Mount Vernon. there is no evidence at all that he, prior to the revolution, seriously questioned slavery at all. And he would have been really unusual if he hadn't, or if he had questioned slavery. The abolition movement in England and the United States didn't really start until right about the revolution. And so that's a sort of a new thing that's coming in then. During the course of the Revolutionary War, well, within 3 years of the start of it, he was writing to his cousin who was managing Mount Vernon in his absence. And he said that he wanted to be rid of slaves. He did not want to be a slave owner anymore. But at that point, Virginia slave owners basically couldn't free their slaves. And so the only way he could get free of being a slave owner would be to sell them. And that brings up other issues because he didn't want to break up families and things like that. So, and what if you sell them to somebody who's, a really, really awful person? Those were all the thoughts going on in his mind. And so it isn't until 1782, I believe, that Virginia made it possible for individual slave owners to manumit their slaves. At that point, Washington is still he's still in the army. The war is still going on. So he doesn't get home until, I think it's Christmas Eve of 1783. And then what he comes home to is an estate, he's been gone for 8 years. And there's a lot of rebuilding that has to be done. He comes home find out, he thought that, all the bills were being paid and everything like that. And he comes home and finds out that he owes a lot of money in taxes. And that there are a lot of debts, and he can't afford to free his slaves at that point. And eventually he takes that step in his will, which he wrote in the summer of 1799. And he frees automatically upon his death his personal servant, William Lee, who was with him all during the war. And it's because of William's loyalty to him during the conflict that he wants him freed immediately. And then the other slaves at Mount Vernon who belonged to George Washington were to be freed when Martha Washington died. He didn't want, we have to get into the issue of the dower slaves. So of the little bit over 300 slaves who were at Mount Vernon in 1799, 123 belonged to George Washington. 153 belonged to the estate of Martha Washington's first husband, Daniel Parke Custis. And according to British common law and also Virginia law, in order to protect a widow after her husband died, if he dies without a will, she automatically has a life interest in 1/3 of the estate, including the slaves, with the other 2/3 being divided among whatever children and other heirs there are. And where was I going with this? And then there were also about another 40 people who were rented from one of the Washington's neighbors. And over the years, 40 years the Washingtons were married, his slaves intermarried with her dower slaves. And so the dower slaves couldn't be freed. They, because of the law, would be divided eventually among Martha's 4 grandchildren. So there were about 20 families that were divided when Washington slaves went free, and the dower slaves were eventually Martha died in 1802, and her slaves were divided pretty equally among the 4 grandchildren. And so as much as Washington didn't want to break up families, it happened.
Do we have any evidence of Martha's thought on the institution of slavery, or is it really more of the primary sources are on George?
More of the primary sources are on George Washington. Martha Washington, I think the thing that really drove her as a slave owner was, well, A, she doesn't own them. She doesn't own the dower slaves. She has a life interest in their use. And then they have to be divided among the heirs. And she doesn't talk about it much in her writings. I think a lot of this was probably family conversations and would have taken place one-on-one or when she's sitting around with the grandkids or something. So she doesn't really write about it. Abigail Adams, the wife of John Adams, who was, so she's the second First Lady of the United States, came to see Martha Washington in December 1801. So it's after George Washington has died, and the date that she comes to visit Martha Washington at Mount Vernon is right about the time that Martha had gone to the courthouse in Fairfax County and signed the paperwork to free George Washington's to free the George Washington slaves, because he provided in his will to free William Lee first, and then the others when Martha died. And she was counseled by several men in the family, some of the other executors, that her life was probably in danger, because there may be people who some of the enslaved people might try to kill her in order to get their freedom sooner. And so she was letting them go they were to be freed on January 1st, 1801. So it's a little over a year after George Washington died. And I think that from the time she was 26 years old when her first husband died, she felt, I think, that it was her duty to keep everybody together, to keep this inheritance together for the sake of whoever the heirs were. And that was her big concern. And while she was with George Washington for half the Revolutionary War, I don't think she would have been, there at the table when, when he was talking to some of the young officers who were anti-slavery. So people like Alexander Hamilton and the Marquis de Lafayette and John Lawrence, who was a young officer from South Carolina. And Washington was aware of these young officers' feelings, both through talking with them and through writing letters back and forth. But Martha wouldn't have, she would have eaten with them, of course, at dinner at headquarters, but it was the custom for women to get up at the end of the meal and leave the room and go and talk with one another about girl things, and leave the men at the table to talk about politics and what do we do with slaves and that sort of thing. So I don't think she had those same influences, and she didn't have people writing to her like they wrote to her husband saying, you should let your people go, and your reputation is going to be shot, if you don't. And she just wasn't there and didn't have those same influences on her. And I think was most concerned about keeping the inheritance together. That was her job. And
that does make sense with most common knowledge of women versus male, female versus male roles during at least the colonial period.
mm-hmm.
What primary sources were you able to use? I know that you've referenced letters between George Washington and other officers. What other primary sources were you able to use for your book, and how and where were you able to find them?
Well, I didn't have a research budget, so I was at Mount Vernon for most of the research, and people were kind enough from other libraries and other historic houses to share material with me from their collection. So that was a big help. We've been very fortunate that George Washington's papers have been available in one form or another for many, many years. The most recent project started at the University of Virginia in the late 1960s, and they're not sure how many volumes they still have to go, but they're getting closer to the end. And so those documents are available with excellent editing that tells you, when he talks about Lieutenant Fraser, who the heck is, is that? Well, they'll have a footnote that explains who he is and what the situation is that's being talked about here. So that's called the Papers of George Washington Project at the University of Virginia. And so those documents are available right now, along with the papers of lots of other people at a site on the archives, the National Archives, called Founders Online. And it's a searchable database. You can search by subject, you can search by name. And so I highly recommend it. And you can narrow it to just one founding father, or if you're looking for cheese, there we are with food again. And you plug in cheese, and you can see what all the founding fathers that they look at had to say about cheese, and where they bought it, and what kind they were eating, and that sort of thing. So those are excellent sources. There are papers projects for a lot of the other founding fathers. So the Adams papers are fantastic. The Jefferson papers. But all of those are really good sources for somebody who's interested in learning more about the founding fathers. A book was published in 1994 called Worthy Partner, which has Martha Washington's correspondence, as well as it was known at the time. Now, since then, the Washington Papers Project at UVA has been working on Martha Washington's papers, and those are due to be published, I think, within the next year. And so they're a fantastic source, especially if you're interested in women's history. But she also has a lot of notes in there in her letters about like when she's writing to her niece Fanny, who is managing the female role in running the plantation during the first and the second term of Washington's presidency. And Martha Washington will often say, now be sure to tell Charlotte, who's one of the seamstresses, that I'd like her to do such and such a thing, or tell Frank, who's the butler, to make sure that before we get home that he's cleaned the pantry and all the glassware and stuff in it as well as possible, and tell the gardener to make sure we're going to want fresh vegetables, because that's one of the best things about living in the country. And so there's a lot of information in Martha's letters about individual slaves. Let's see, what else? Other family correspondence, letters from, you know, sisters and brothers and nieces and nephews and all that kind of thing. Legal papers, so people's wills are an important source of information. I'm thinking of the will of Hannah Bushrod Washington, who was one of George Washington's sisters-in-law. And Hannah, in her will, is looking at dividing up all her personal possessions and which child or niece or nephew gets what. And then she also talks about several of the enslaved women that she wants to leave, you know, suggests that they could leave some of her clothing to, if they wanted to. She says, even though, you know, this one and this one have been very mean to me while I've been dying, you know. You know, so, which says that, yeah, there's some tension in that household. Yeah, Mount Vernon was, because of Washington's fame, was a really popular destination for a lot of people who were coming. He wrote to his mother one time after the Revolutionary War and said that she had been, you know, hinting that she might like to come to Mount Vernon to live, and he wrote her back and said that I don't think you'll like it here. He said Mount Vernon is pretty much it's like a well-resorted tavern, and he said basically anybody going from north to south or south to north stops by there, and these are often people they don't know, and but they have to give them a place to sleep and some food. And because his mother was older and at that point I think had breast cancer, that she's not well, and she would have to get dressed if she came downstairs to be with people, and you get the impression that a lot of times she's probably just in her nightgown, and you know, so that wouldn't work. And but there were a lot of people coming, several hundred a year, and because I've gone through, you know, Washington's diaries and added them up. A lot of them would leave descriptions of Mount Vernon. It would send letters to, you know, their family back in France or whatever, saying, oh, this is what the situation is like. So those stories are really important. Let's see, what else? Financial records. We've got decades of Washington's financial ledgers. And he's like, you know, it would have been like being married to an accountant or something, you know, those people who say, now you must write down everything you're spending, you know, and that's what he does, you know. And so there's a lot of information. You know, you might not think financial records would be so great, but they tell you what they're buying for the slaves, and also what the slaves are buying from the Washingtons, so, or what they're selling to the Washingtons. So there's evidence for some of the slaves buying whiskey from Washington's, or his distillery towards the end of his life. Sometimes they're buying fresh meat. Sometimes they're buying wheat and flour from his mill, and then they're selling honey back to the Washingtons, and lots of times chickens, and all kinds of vegetables and fruits and things like that they're growing in their own garden plots. And so, or, you know, a big fish they caught or something when on their own time. Well, there were enslaved people from Mount Vernon and also from neighboring plantations who were selling, you know, ducks they shot down on. And yes, they did have, some of them were allowed access to guns. So, they might be trapping extra food or whatever. So you can find out a lot of really cool stuff from the financial records, and even things about, when enslaved people were being purchased or sold. And yeah, so those are the kinds of sources.
Those are fabulous sources. Those are many of the same things that we use here in Connecticut. Probate records, wills, all of those things are extremely valuable. In those sources, and many historians find this very, very difficult because it is very rare. Are there any primary sources about specific individuals that were enslaved, or by specific individuals that were enslaved by the Washingtons?
Not not specifically, like if you were asking for a primary source from a person of the Washington's stature, you'd be looking for letters, you'd be looking for other kinds of things, other kinds of sources. What we tend to have are visitor accounts where someone's talking to William Lee or talking to somebody else about what it was like to work for the Washingtons. When Hercules ran away, and the cook, there was a French prince and his servant at Mount Vernon, and they were both interested in slaves because this was slavery was an institution that they really weren't accustomed to. And so Louis Philippe, the prince, is talking to a number of the slaves, and they talk to Hercules' daughter, and this is about, he describes her as being about 5 years old, and they asked her, "Don't you miss aren't you sad because you'll never see because your father has run away and you may never see him again?" And she said, "Oh no, sir, I am happy because he's free now." So there are little things like that show up in some of those visitor accounts where they've been talking to enslaved people. One of my favorites, not in a, I love, not because you love it, because it's because it can be very sad information. There was a source we just learned about, I think in the year before the book came out, was an account written by John Gadsby Chapman, who was a 19th century artist who was at Mount Vernon and the homes of several of the Washington grandchildren, and he's interviewing them as well as making drawings of the things he's seeing. And he interviews Lawrence Lewis, who is both George Washington's nephew and the husband of Martha Washington's youngest granddaughter. And Lawrence was one of the executors of George Washington's will. And he's asking him about stories about Washington's great physical strength. And Lawrence Lewis tells a story, and then he segues into several stories that were told to him by Isaac, who was the head carpenter, was an enslaved man. And Isaac so he's quoting Isaac, but Isaac had told him this story about how there was one day, he'd been assigned to do, Washington asked him to do some specific cuts on a tree that had been cut down. It had to do with the way they were going to be using the wood. And Washington wanted it done a specific way. for whatever it was they were using this for. And the next morning, when Washington came out there, Isaac hadn't done, Isaac had not done it the way Washington had wanted it done. He tried to do it because he didn't have enough strength himself to turn the tree trunk. And there was nobody around to help him, and he knew he needed to get it done. But the way he did it ruined it for whatever purpose Washington had intended it. And Isaac said that without saying anything, Washington walked up and like backhanded him, and which sent him, and Isaac's been a carpenter for decades. So those are strong, sturdy guys. And Isaac said he just, kind of reeled. And when he came to and got back to his senses, he was just, Washington was gone. And, so this is one of those stories that it's another source, but it's through several different people telling this story. Other former slaves at Mount Vernon, would talk to the neighbors in the area, maybe while they were trying to get them to sell some birds or buy some birds or fish or something that they caught. And they would tell stories about George Washington and about life at Mount Vernon. And so those stories then become part of the story of the neighborhood, and would sometimes appear in like 19th century newspapers. So you can find the information in lots and lots of different places, and a lot of times just by happenstance. So,
what are the typical experiences that we can, or that we have evidence for the enslaved population at Mount Vernon?
So by the end of the Washington's lifetime, most of the people who were there on the plantation were American born. And one of the cool things that we worked out was that there were several generations in a lot of cases of individual families. So it's not just a single person. I think there's a tendency, or there was a tendency, to sort of think of, okay, they came in from Africa, they wouldn't have known anybody, they couldn't have talked to anybody, they could, but they're actually, getting married, having children. So there are, multiple, there are grandparents and great grandparents and stuff like that. So for someone who was born at Mount Vernon, which would have been the experience probably for most of them by the end of the 18th century, they would be, born into a family. Most of the adults were married. There were some single women who didn't have husbands, but most of the children are being born into a home with a mother and father, although the mother and father may not have lived on the same farm. And so, and they only would have been able to see each other on like Saturday night and Sunday during the week. So the main experience for children growing up would have been to have two parents, but not necessarily, but during the week, their mothers were the ones who were taking care of them. So they were being raised by single moms during the week. Children generally didn't have this was like the time of freedom in their lives. And so you would often have like older kids looking after the younger ones. There's some evidence occasionally for an older maybe somebody who was too old to work in the field, but they could still kind of, wrangle little kids during the day or something with help from the older children. So this is a time when, they seem to have been playing a lot of times, and there are complaints from Washington about them, messing up his shrubs, things like that. They probably had, because they were like little family plots where they grew vegetables and raised chickens and stuff like that. The older kids probably had chores to do, perhaps looking after those gardens and hauling water and hauling wood for their cabin and that sort of thing, while also looking after the really little kids. Then when the kids get somewhere between the age of about 11 and 14, they move into a group called Working Boys and Girls. And this is sort of a way of kind of easing them into working every day. And so they're doing, work that's not as hard as the adults are doing, but we're getting them used to this kind of thing. And I think the reason there's that 3-year, 11 to 14 gap or period when they're with the working boys and girls is because kids mature and grow at different rates. And so one child might be ready to go to work, at least in this a little bit lesser form at 11, but somebody else might, not be that big or mature enough to do that until they're like 14. So that's why that's going on. And so by the time, somebody's 15 or so, they're all, they've all moved into their adult jobs. And so that's kind of what would happen. And people would work at those adult jobs until they couldn't. And that would vary quite a bit, just because individual people are different in their experiences, depending on accidents and things that might have happened to them would make a difference in how late somebody could work. But according to the Virginia laws about freeing slaves, someone was, people who were going to free their slaves had to continue, even so when the papers were signed, they still had to continue to take care of anyone who was too young to work, or too old to work, or too frail to work. And so and according to the law, that meant too old to work was anybody who was over 45. So, which tells you how hard the work that they've been doing was. If you expect a certain percentage of them aren't going to be able to work after they're 45. So that's basically sort of the outline of what someone's life at Mount Vernon would have been like. People often approached Washington about getting maybe a different job. So Kate, who was a field worker on one of the outlying farms, came to George Washington and asked if she could be the midwife for the other women. And so Washington said, I don't have any problem with that. He's telling his manager, and he says, just, look into it and make sure she knows what she's doing. And if she does, that's fine. And so people felt free to come to the Washingtons if they were having a problem with an overseer, if they weren't getting enough food or that kind of thing. So Washington would sometimes ask the advice of some of his field workers or overseers, like, why do they think something's not working? Why isn't the stuff growing the way it should, or something like that? So there is, there's some give and take and some back and forth going on.
Definitely, that's an interesting perspective.
Mhm.
45 is so surprising.
I think a lot of people, most of the records we have directly from enslaved people, like Frederick Douglass and so Harriet Tubman and other people who wrote about it, it tends to come from the 19th century. And slavery in the 19th century was in some ways very different from what it was earlier in the 18th century. The ideas about things tend to harden, and so you always have to keep in mind when is this happening, and what's the bigger picture of what's happening with slavery at this time when something happened.
And then you spoke briefly about how George's perspective changes over his lifetime. What do his writings and the records of his later life reveal about his feelings on slavery?
Just that he really would like to do away with slavery, but he's got a lot of issues, or there are a lot of things in the way of being able to do that. So most people hadn't gotten there in terms of their own slaves or the slaves of others. They just couldn't see enslaved people being free. And so that's an issue. And it's such an issue that, Washington, was president of the Constitutional Convention, and there was a lot of debate there about the issue of slavery. And basically, delegates from Georgia and North and South Carolina were not going to stick around and be part of the new government if they had to get rid of their slaves. And they were even against doing away with the slave trade, the incoming slave trade. And so Washington knew that this thing that he cared so much about, like bringing this new country into being, wasn't going to happen if he or others pushed the issue of doing away with abolishing slavery. During the Revolution, there had been a number of things that sort of pushed him in the direction of abolition. There was the rhetoric in the war where people were talking about liberty and freedom and not wanting to be slaves to England. And, he's not stupid. He can see the hypocrisy. So that was one thing. He's got these young officers who are anti-slavery, and they're young men that he admires, and he values their opinions, and so that's an influence on him during the war. A lot of abolitionists from England are writing to him about doing away with slavery, and so they're sending him pamphlets and books they've written and stuff like that. So he's learning a lot about these issues, and he says to people over and over again, that he would vote for abolition if it came up, but he really thought that rather than doing one big sweeping taking one big sweeping action, that he thought the right way to do it would be through the individual state legislatures and oh, come on, brain work. Um, and he thought it should be a gradual process. And so he's not, coming up with that just out of the blue, because during and immediately after the revolution, the New England states, for the most part, abolished slavery. And this is, I'm sort of making a big picture here. So a lot of the New England states freed the enslaved people who were there. Doesn't mean that prejudice against them went away, but it does mean that they were freed. And then the sort of mid-Atlantic states like New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, tended to set up these gradual abolition plans, which is what Washington hoped Virginia would do, and they didn't. And then you have the very southern states, Georgia and the Carolinas, who are not going to go. So I think he felt that if he said more publicly, that it might break up the Union. But those are the sort of things that were influencing him to take that step. So basically, at the end of his life, Virginia hadn't done what he'd hoped that they would do, and so he manumitted the people he could, the only way he could, which was to free them in his will.
That's a difficult position to be in, to be such a prominent figure, and to realize that this could lead to basically the decimation of the country that you just tried to build. Thank you for that, Mary. Those were all of the questions that okay. we had prepared for our program tonight, but I do have a couple of questions from our audience.
Okay.
So I have one, and it says, I seem to remember Lame Alice, Hercules, I believe it was Hercules' wife, to take care of kids too. Is that correct?
I don't remember, but she for the most part, she was a spinner. And one of the things that was kind of interesting is that a number of the people who were doing spinning and sewing as their regular job are disabled in some way. So there's Lame Alice and Lame Peter. Peter was a knitter, and I believe Alice was a spinner. And there are other people who are maybe temporarily doing that kind of work because they're sick or something like that, or they can't get around well or whatever. But yeah, the textile trades tended to be, I think that disabled people could do.
And it seemed to be at least from her questions, an occupation where you might be able to look after smaller children at the same time, perhaps?
Maybe.
Our other question is, when talking about working until you couldn't, could you speak of those who retired? And she says, with regard to Lee, I believe so.
To William Lee? Okay. Yeah, that's sort of what would happen. There wasn't an age you could get to where they would say, okay, now you don't have to work anymore, because there would usually be something that they would have you do. So William Lee, who was Washington's valet, had two serious accidents when he was, the first, this is after they come back from the revolution and before the presidency. And so William and George Washington were surveying a local property, and William slipped on it sounds like he was maybe crossing a creek or something, and slipped on a wet rock and landed on his knee. And William apparently, he was not a slim, person. So there's a lot of weight landing on that knee, which dislocated the kneecap, which sounds just awful. And there didn't seem to be much they could do to fix that at that point. And then a few years later, he was, as part of his job as Washington's valet or personal servant, was in Alexandria to pick up the mail at the post office, and fell in front of the post office and dislocated the other knee. So now both of them are bad. And Washington, a few years later, was given had been elected president, and William is insisting on going north with him. And Washington writes back to his secretary, Tobias Lear, and says, somebody's going to have to look after him, and and he's going to be more trouble than but he said, since it's William and I really can't tell him no, let him come up. And so he was with them in the presidential mansion for about a year. And just the trip up to New York exacerbated the injuries with his knees, and he had to be in Philadelphia, under a doctor's care for a month or 6 weeks, and so they had to leave him there and get up for the inauguration and then bring him up later. And then he came back to Mount Vernon and was the shoemaker, which is a job that he could do without a lot of walking. We know that William, towards the end of his life, became an alcoholic. This is after George Washington died. And there's a good chance that it happened because of the pain from his knees, and there really wasn't a lot you could do for pain at that period. So it's very sad. Other people, Doll, who had been the cook at Mount Vernon for many, many years, when she got older, it sounds like she didn't do a whole lot, but Martha Washington would sometimes write home and to her niece and say, could you have Doll? She can't have forgotten how to do, how to preserve XYZ or whatever. So could you get her to do that? And so if there was something somebody could still do later, even after they were elderly, they might get assigned to do that.
Right, that makes sense. That makes complete sense. We do have another question. Sarah asks, were there any particular enslaved people that were interesting to research?
Oh, yeah. Well, all of them are pretty interesting, but one of my favorites is a man named Sambo Anderson. Sambo was an African-born slave who was captured there as a little boy and brought to Virginia and sold, and George Washington, brought him here. He was trained to he became a carpenter, and he was trained in carpentry by a man named Bernard Sears, his first name, maybe William Bernard Sears, who was an indentured Englishman who did fantastic carvings at Mount Vernon and at Gunston Hall and at Pohick Church was the church that George Washington and George Mason attended. And so he had a really important craftsman teach him how to become a carpenter. And Lorena Walsh, it's kind of interesting that, he's the only person there named Sambo, which is an African name from the Hausa or Fulani people who are Muslim or were Muslim by the time, by the mid-18th century. He wore earrings and had tattoos and tribal cuts on his face. Lorena Walsh, who's a very important historian who was at Williamsburg for decades, Lorena says he probably had to fight to keep his name so that he didn't just become another guy named Sam. He was Sambo, and it was used for a name that was used for someone who was a second son in these the Fulani and Hausa people. He married and had a number of children, and then he belonged outright to George Washington. He's one who was purchased by George Washington. And so after he was freed, he continued to live in a cabin on the Mount Vernon property. And he supported himself and his family by hunting and fishing. And he would sell game to the hotels and restaurants in Alexandria and to some of the rich families there. And he purchased several of his children and grandchildren, and apparently was widely known. There was the local papers did an obituary for him when he died, so he was well known in the area. And so he's one of my favorites.
Amazing.
Yeah.
He sounds like a very interesting figure. I'd love to hear more about him.
Yeah, I would like to too.
Mary, one of my other questions that I was thinking about earlier when you discussed how historic sites it seemed to be a lack of interpretation. How has Mount Vernon changed their interpretation? Obviously, you've been doing research for many, many years, but how has that been translated into the public face of the organization?
So, well, they've incorporated information about the slaves at Mount Vernon into the tours in the mansion. We have a huge exhibit. I don't know if people have been at Mount Vernon lately, but in 2006 we opened up a new museum and education center. And the museum part has like 5,000 square feet, of which 1,000 square feet is a temporary exhibit, a rotating exhibit kind of space. And so when we managed to talk people into doing an exhibit on slavery. And we were meeting with the designer and the curatorial staff and everybody, and this exhibit was going to go into the 1,000 square foot temporary exhibit space. We were trying to figure out how we could tell this huge story in 1,000 square feet. And someone brought up said, well, why don't we take over the whole museum? Oh boy, because that meant, talking to the board and trying to get them on board with it and everything. And they gave us permission to do that. And so the exhibit opened in the fall of 2016, and I think we'll be up until next year. We've extended it several times. And so people can come and see that. There's a publication that goes along with it, a catalog that has, photographs of a lot of the objects and things. We have an archaeology department now who they started in 1984, I think, and we had hired like a contract archaeologist for 2 or 3 years, and then in '87 we had our own archaeology department, and they've been doing some great work. And so there, you can see them often out on the grounds in the excavation season. So, and people can ask them questions and stuff. We've got special interpreters who do character interpretation, some of whom are African American, and so they have a character that they, or more, that they interpret. And we've got just a number of special programs and things going on all the time. They do podcasts and stuff, and there's also a tour that's focused on the enslaved people at Mount Vernon, and so you can't get away from it now.
Lives Bound Together, is that correct?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah, that's
fabulous exhibit.
I'm glad you've seen it.
Pieces of it. I have not been to Mount Vernon yet. I plan to get there someday. And Mary, what do you hope that readers come away from the book either learning, or what is the big message that you hope that they take away from your book?
One of the things would be that it's a very complicated issue, and lots of different perspectives, and also I think the fact that slavery was so embedded in the culture that it was really hard to like Washington ran into problems with how do you free people, which and he was criticized by the neighbors when he freed his people, and a lot of Virginians felt like the state wasn't ready for it, and you suddenly got all these freed people, and what are they going to do? And they did actually fairly well within the grandchildren. So within 2 generations, well, even before, by 1810, the freed people from Mount Vernon have formed several free Black communities in the area. By the time you're with the grandchildren of the people who were freed, they're starting to buy land. They're they're getting their own farms. They're sometimes founding churches and that kind of thing. So they're doing okay. Could be better, but they're making it, and
that's a silver lining to their story, to hear that their later generations do grow into their own community, which is, it's a nice way to hear about the next generation. We do have another question, and they ask, is the Hercules interpreter on Mount Vernon site now called Hercules Posey?
Is that from Ramin?
That is from Ramin. That is from our director, Ramin. It is indeed.
We don't have anybody who is, that I'm aware of, who is specifically depicting Hercules. So we don't have anyone doing him right now.
And just for our audience who probably doesn't know the stories of Hercules, Hercules was Washington's enslaved cook. And I am not the expert on him, but the museum's executive director has researched his life extensively and has actually written a fictionalized version of his life that was out, I believe, last year. And there's been research done by the museum into Hercules after he escaped, after he fled the Washingtons. And our archivist, along with Ramin, was able to find Hercules under the name Hercules Posey, where he is buried in New York after he fled. Just a little bit of background. I'm sure that there will be more interpretation on that in the comments as Ramin and Sarah, our archivists, fill in that amazing story. And you can actually find a blog post on the museum's website, a bit more information on that story, which is just an amazing story. And it's really fabulous that we have the research to support this and kind of wrap up this story of this enslaved man, Hercules Posey. I hope that Mount Vernon would someday interpret Hercules. That would be wonderful.
Yeah. I think the fact that he wasn't there in 1799 is probably one of the reasons why he isn't. But yeah, we will have to do a special program or something about him at some point. And the thing is, when you come out with a book, you sort of are thinking, in some ways, I hope this shakes loose some more research and stuff about the topic, which it did. Thank you, Ramin, for doing that. But you're always also sort of going, okay, what big cache of information didn't I have? Didn't I know? And you always know. And so anyway, I was delighted when Ramin and Sarah sat down and really tried to find out what happened to him. Because the last information we had from the 18th century sources was someone who had written to Martha Washington and Richard Varick, who had been one of Washington's generals colonel during the Revolutionary War. Anyway, he had written back to Martha Washington after George Washington died and said, "Do you want me to keep looking for him?" Or I don't have his letters, or didn't have to have his letter to her, so we don't know exactly what he said. But from her answer, it sounds like it was. She said, "Don't bother looking for him." She said, I found a replacement. And what she didn't say was she had already freed George Washington's slaves, and Hercules would have been in that group. And so she wasn't continuing to look for him. And where was I going with that? So that's the last we knew. And so Ramin and Sarah, I guess, has a lot of background in trying to trace African-American genealogy. And she was thinking, well, we know he came from the Posey family, who were neighbors of the Washingtons, and George Washington purchased Hercules when he was a teenager from the Poseys. And she said, let me look for him. We had a sneaking suspicion he was in New York. And so she searches for Hercules Posey, and darn if he isn't cooking for somebody, in there. So she was, they were able to, the two of them were able to find out, when he died, and he died in an epidemic, and where he was buried. And this is just absolutely amazing. And I think they're working on getting a historical marker or something for the site of the cemetery, which isn't there anymore.
Yes, we would love to see a commemoration of him.
Mm-hmm.
Wherever that commemoration would be, it would be lovely to have him remembered in some way. That would be wonderful. Well, thank you so much for joining me this evening, Mary. I know we went a bit over our intended time, but that's all right. I understand that your book can be found wherever books are being sold. Mount Vernon sells it on their website, and then, of course, Amazon and Barnes & Noble carry them as well. We do encourage everyone to go and pick up a copy of the book. And is there anything else that you would like to share before we sign off this evening, Mary?
Oh, I just wanted to say that I was told about 10 days ago about an honor, and I was told I couldn't say anything about it until the press release came out. And so today, the Society for Historians of the Early American Republic sent out their press release that said that the only unavoidable subject of regret was the 2020 winner of their society's biography award. So that's pretty exciting.
Very exciting, very exciting. Congratulations, Mary.
I don't think it'll cost any more just because it won,
A new edition will have to come out with a sticker on the front. Award winning. Well, thank you so much for joining me this evening, Mary. Thank you all for joining us, for sticking around for our very long discussion, but this will, of course, be posted online. We will have links to the book and to other resources connected to the unavoidable subject of regret. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for asking me.
Of course. Have a wonderful evening, everyone.
Good night.